Hello and welcome back to Real Crime Profile. This is Jim Clementi, retired FBI profiler and former New York City prosecutor, currently writer and producer on CBS's Criminal Minds. Today with me is...
Laura Richards. I'm a criminal behavioural analyst and I'm also director and founder of Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service.
And Lisa Zambetti. I am the casting director for Criminal Minds and Beyond Borders.
Well, today, listeners, we have a very special guest, and I want to introduce you to Bill Thomas. Bill, would you mind telling our listeners who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm Bill Thomas. Professionally, I'm the outgoing Associate Executive Director at the Art Directors Guild here in Los Angeles, and I'm also, sadly, the brother of a murder victim, Cathy Thomas, who was killed as part of the Colonial Parkway murders.
Yeah, well, we're very sorry that that happened to your sister, and our goal here today, as we sort of have instituted in this podcast, is to look at cases, unfortunately violent criminal cases, but from a victim's perspective. We want to bring life to the victims and speak for the victims. So we're very happy to have you here today, and we'd like to know, obviously, much more about Cathy. But first, can you tell us an overview of the Colonial Parkway murders case? What is it? How many victims? When did it happen? And so forth.
Sure. With the Colonial Parkway murders, what you have is it's a series of the murders of 8 young people, 4 couples, in and around the Williamsburg, Virginia area from 1986 to 1989. What you have are 4 couples, 1 gay and 3 straight, who were murdered approximately 1 couple a year for 4 years in a row from 1986 to 1989. And then the murders apparently stop. There are other potentially other related cases that might be related to the Colonial Parkway murders, but they appear to have a beginning and an end. 2 of the cases are FBI cases because of where the cars were found. They were on federal property at the Colonial Parkway. And 2 of the cases are Virginia State Police cases because they were found off the Colonial Parkway. So you have 3 different agencies, that is 2 covered by 2 separate Virginia State Police offices and 1 FBI case.
Right. And that's already, being in law enforcement for several decades, I know that already creates problems when you have cases that could be connected, that may not be necessarily obviously connected, but they fall in different police jurisdictions or law enforcement jurisdictions that could already signal a problem of why a case isn't solved immediately.
And that's what we found with the Colonial Parkway murders. Again, I'm going to point some things out in our conversation today. They're not intended as criticisms of law enforcement, but the 30th anniversary of the beginning of the case will be this October 10th, 2016. And so obviously there at times when I'm telling you different aspects of the case, it may sound like I'm criticizing law enforcement. That's not the reason I'm here today, but I do want to let people know kind of how we think we got to where we are.
Yeah, and that's totally legitimate, and we can talk about it, and we will bounce back and forth with ideas and questions, and what it is what it is. So I'm going to quickly just read the names, ages, and dates of the different double homicides that are involved in this Colonial Parkway murder case. So the first, Kathleen Thomas, she was 27, and Rebecca Ann Dowski, she was 21. And that happened on October 12th, 1986. We'll go back into the details of those cases in a few minutes. The second double homicide was David Knobling. He was 20, and Robin Edwards, who was 14. They were killed on September 23rd, 1987. The third, presumed double homicide, but we're not certain of it, is Richard Call, who was 20, and Cassandra Haley, who was 18. They went missing, and they're presumed dead from very, very closely related to, that crime scene was very closely related to the area where your sister and Rebecca Dowski went missing. And the fourth double homicide is Daniel Lauer, who was 21, and Anna Marie Phelps, who was 18. And they were killed on September 5th, 1989. So those are the 4 double homicides that have been linked in this particular case. But I know, Laura, you also want to talk about another double homicide that you believe may be related.
Yeah, and I think, as we've talked in the past about cases, one of the key things with series is ensuring that the right things have been linked. Linkage analysis is very, very tricky, and it relies on micro detail and the nuanced context. And when links are made and they're wrong, it has some catastrophic effects, or consequences, I should say. So, with this particular case and series, and I think it is complicated and complex, and because it's historic as well, there are some challenges there, and with politics and geographic boundaries and so on. But for me, there's one case I think that's definitely worth discussing, and that's the Julianne Marie Williams and Laura or Lolly Winans double homicide, which happened May 1996, and Julianne was 24 at the time, and she was found dead with her, or murdered, I should say, with her partner, who was 26-year-old Laura. They were in a relationship together, and some of the behavioural details of what happened to them, for me, are strikingly similar to what happened to Cathy and Rebecca. So I think they're definitely worth discussing in a bit of detail, because everything will hang on. It's not just necessarily what is done, it's also what's absent and what you don't see in a case. And for me, more often than not, it's that part that can be the most significant when linking cases together.
Yeah, and Laura and I know this because we've been doing this for decades, but the fact is that behavior can tell volumes. When you can't actually link cases forensically, behavior can sometimes do it for you. And because there are aspects of crimes that are behavioral, like the MO, the method of operation, modus operandi, the actions necessary to commit a crime, coupled with any ritual aspects, things that aren't necessary to commit the crime, but are therefore sort of unexplained, but the offender does them, and in serial cases does them repeatedly, because they satisfy an inner need or desire of that person.
And it's idiosyncratic to them, and that's the unique part that
Right.
we tend to be looking for.
Right, and so we call a very rare combination of both MO and ritual a signature. And so we'll be looking at the cases, Bill, for those kinds of aspects as you go through the factors and the forensic science details and the behavioral details. We'll ask you questions about those kinds of things so that we can actually focus our attention on that behavior. And Lisa, if you wouldn't mind, because Laura and I are very familiar with these cases, if you wouldn't mind sort of letting us know if there's areas that we talk about where we just skip over explaining to the audience what we mean and where it is and so forth.
Sure.
It'd be very helpful to have that kind of background from you.
That'd be great.
Yeah, full disclosure, we sat down one night for a number of hours several months ago and talked about the case, the three of us, Jim, Laura, and myself. So, there may be some shorthand because obviously I'm dealing with two people that asked a ton of questions that evening. And actually, I think that puts you more in the place of the listener in case we do skip over.
I am happy to be the listener. One thing I do want to ask that some people, our listeners, may ask, because I'm not familiar with this part of the country at all, and looking at the Colonial Parkway, what it actually is, how long it is.
Oh, sure.
It looks like it splits Virginia, and it goes from one body of water to another body of water. And how long is it? 23 miles?
Yeah,
or?
I've never lived there, and as a matter of fact, I'm going to be there next week. It's designed for pleasure use. In other words, it's 2 lanes divided with a very leafy, pretty, green area in the middle, a lot of beautiful flowers and plants and that sort of thing. And there are these pull-offs that are designed for recreational use. Now, obviously, during the day, you see people swimming there and fishing and, At night, it gets a bit more romantic, and this is a place where couples might go to be alone. So we're talking about very pretty, at night, very dark, no street lights. Just to give you a sense of the kind of the parkway, it's very lightly traveled in the evening and lightly patrolled by by local law enforcement. And by the National Park Service. There's no trucks on the 23-mile long parkway. It's a pretty spot, but it can get a little spooky at night.
So you're saying 2 of the cars were found just off of the parkway.
In these pull-offs.
Right.
But there's one part that's sort of seen as a lover's lane type aspect with where some of the gay community would go, as I understand it.
Yeah, and actually all 4 sites where the cars were found had some attachment to, a place where people would go to be alone. They also might be a place where you might go to do a low-level drug deal, too, because you can see for quite a long way in either direction. And as I understand it, even at night, you can hear cars coming in either direction for quite some time. So it's the sort of place where if you wanted to go and be alone, that would be the spot. It's also a place where kids would sometimes go to party, again, because there are not a lot of cops around.
Yeah, and so 2 of the actual cases that we're going to be talking about, the first one involving your sister and the third one involving a missing couple that was never, their bodies were never found, were actually on the parkway. But the other 2 were sort of in the area, but actually not on that parkway. They've only been connected to this case because they're relatively close geographically in the southeastern part of Virginia, but they weren't actually committed on the parkway.
Right. And according to the FBI, and I've revisited this question within the last few weeks, nothing in the forensics so far actually links these cases. The basic circumstances, cars, isolated rural location, they're all in this same area of Virginia, Lover's Lane, couples, out on dates, that kind of thing. I know we'll get into more details about how the couples were killed, which vary significantly from case to case. But there's nothing in the forensics that the FBI has told me, and we've revisited this question several times in the last 7 years. Nothing in the forensics, according to the Bureau, actually links the 4 cases.
Right, but
Currently speaking.
Yes, because obviously this case, they started 30 years ago. DNA evidence at that time was certainly in a much, much worse state than it is today. And with STR today, you can take literally cells, a small grouping of cells that are microscopic, and actually get a DNA profile off them. So one caveat to that is it may be misleading because in the average person's car that's more than 5 years old, there's probably DNA from dozens and dozens of people that may not have anything to do with the actual crime. So you have to still sift through that kind of evidence and actually determine if there's actually a connection to the case. But, Bill, why don't you just go through and, just for our listeners to sort of set the stage for this, go through the 4 that have been linked to the Colonial Parkway and just say how they were murdered, how the bodies were found, what were the circumstances, or in the case where they're missing, what were the circumstances around those cases?
Sure.
Very briefly.
Well, the first case is my sister, Cathy Thomas, and her then-girlfriend, Rebecca Dowski. They've been dating for a few months. They think they went missing on a Thursday night at William and Mary, where Becky was preparing a computer assignment that was due the following day. They were there with 2 other female friends, one of whom was also taking a class with Becky. They seem to have gone missing on a Thursday night. Their bodies were found in my sister's white Honda Civic, a 1980 Honda Civic, 2.5 days later on a Sunday afternoon by a passerby.
And it was the car had been pushed off this scenic overlook area, right? And there was an attempt to light it on fire, right?
Right. So the car was obscured from the surface of the road so that the National Park Service rangers that would have been driving up and down the parkway in cop car type vehicles, they probably would not have been able to see the vehicle. A passerby who was out of his vehicle, I've been told walking or running, but he was closer to the surface of the water. He saw the vehicle which had rolled down this embankment.
And what condition were the bodies in that case?
Well, in this case, Cathy and Becky were both found in the car. Cathy was in the way back, the hatchback area, which is actually fairly small. I spent a lot of time in that car. And Becky was in the back seat, kind of on the diagonal with her feet extending over towards the passenger side. Both women had been strangled with rope, and then their throats had been cut from beyond ear to ear. Cathy was essentially decapitated. And then there's this odd, at least to me, attempt to set the car on fire using kerosene or diesel fuel. The FBI mostly says diesel fuel now, but back then sometimes they referred to it as kerosene. But there was an attempt to set the car on fire with diesel fuel spread inside the car and on the surface of the car, and then there's an attempt to, kind of a clumsy attempt in my opinion, to set the car on fire.
Well, that would go to criminal sophistication or lack thereof, but diesel fuel is not like gasoline in terms of its ability to catch fire very easily. So it is in the diesel engine. It actually has to have a heater in order to heat it up to a certain temperature so that it will then catch fire with the spark plug. But in this case, obviously, whoever did this wasn't sophisticated enough or didn't plan it enough criminally to actually successfully burn that car.
Right. We wonder if if that's a mistake or not, although the diesel fuel did obscure a tremendous amount of detail inside the car in particular, because the women's bodies had been soaked in the diesel fuel and it created quite a mess, and it would have obscured a lot of detail that might have been helpful from an investigator's
Right. And
point of view.
their wrists were bound as well, weren't
Correct.
they? Which again, is an interesting factor. And I think Cathy had a clump of hair in her hand that
She did.
indicated she may well have fought back.
And there are
quite
some
vigorously.
limited signs of struggle. There's, I think it's tearing on the right webbing. If you look at your thumb and your forefinger, that kind of fleshy area, that was torn where she may have reached up to pull the rope away from her neck, and she may have struggled with her attacker or attackers. There's some bruising. It doesn't look like it was, a tremendously protracted struggle.
So
Right.
they were clothed, and so they were still wearing their clothes, and there was no sign of a sexual assault or robbery.
Right. So there's no robbery. There's no sexual assault. There's, I would say, a limited sign of struggle. And there's an odd detail, and this shows up again, where Cathy's purse was open, but there's money in the purse. And even from the very beginning, I remember the FBI saying to us within 48 hours, they thought that Cathy and Becky might have been approached by an authority figure. And we didn't quite understand that. And this, of course, means more to all of you in that world. They meant a law enforcement person. They meant, or someone posing as law enforcement. And keep in mind, again, think about this dark place. If someone came up with the brights on and pulled up behind you, they might appear to present, maybe even with a flashlight.
And then they get out and they rap on the window,
Sure.
and they think
And-
they're coming to ask about ID or question them,
Sure.
and who
And
they
I
are.
think of myself in that kind of situation as a younger man with a girlfriend back in the day, and that happened once or twice. It's a little embarrassing, and maybe you're trying to button up your blouse or what have you, and but someone comes along and presents as law enforcement. Something else has been noted again recently by the FBI, that this killer or killers, they were fairly organized from their perspective. In other words, they brought these materials with them, and for the most part, they took them away. There is a small section of rope that was left with ends cut under Cathy's hair, so there is a piece of the rope. But these are materials, and they've used the expression murder kit. And again, these are terms of art that you guys are probably more familiar with than I am. But they said, this individual brings these things with them, the rope, the knives, the diesel fuel. And they've even said recently, there's a possibility they grabbed the wrong can. In other words, as Jim said, maybe they were intending to use gasoline, which obviously is much more likely to catch on fire.
But when you say there's a piece of rope cut at both ends on the back of her neck, was it embedded in her neck that caused it to stay? Why would they take the remainder of the rope and leave that?
I'm not sure. In other words, I don't know. And in other words, the autopsy that the family gets is the cleaned up version that's nowhere near as detailed.
Well, I just wonder if it wasn't the fact that since she was cut basically beyond ear to ear, whether the rope was on her neck when she was being cut, and that cutting itself is what severed that piece of rope, and that's how it came off. The rest of it came off of her, and the person did not think to look and see if they had left a piece of the rope there. So when you say somebody is organized, I don't want to accept that at face value. I don't believe that that's a very organized thing to do. The fact that that person might have a rope handy, that person might have come up with a ruse, yeah, those are organized aspects, but I think there's also some disorganized aspects in this. And I think that since 30 years ago, the Behavioral Analysis Unit has stepped away from very bold distinctions between organized and disorganized behavior. And we look more at many times as mixed scenes because people don't anticipate, even the ones that do plan ahead can't anticipate everything. So it's not unusual to have mixed organized and
Particularly
disorganized.
if you have two victims as well, which
control,
would be very
right.
difficult to control.
I was
So-
going to ask that question. Was there ever an explanation on how this person could have controlled two women, tied them up? I mean, did he or
Person
whoever,
or persons.
yes,
Yeah.
approach with a gun and get them to a certain...
Right.
Well, it's an interesting question, and actually that through line, Lisa, is, for instance, if you accept that some or all of these cases are related, then an individual or perhaps two people are gaining control over 8 healthy young people. And I know we'll get into more details of the other cases, but there is a very high degree of control. I do want to go back to organization for a second. There is, one of the investigators said to me just in the last few weeks, it does seem like there are elements that are not organized. In other words, remember, ultimately, after all of these steps have been taken, ultimately the perpetrator pushes the car over the edge of the embankment and it rolls down towards the surface of the river where it gets caught in brush. And as one of the investigators said to me recently, this person sort of has a plan A, a plan B, or a plan C, as each, aspect unfolds. But it might not be quite that organized, to Jim's point. In other words, it could have easily gotten very messy. And after this, my word, clumsy attempt to set the car on fire, then you could argue, well, then there's a sort of a panicked attempt to see if I can push this car into the river. But in other words, maybe it's not all going exactly according to plan.
Well, the one thing is the fantasy and reality are always two very
Always.
different things.
Right.
And, people do something called in vivo tryouts, and it's Latin for in real life tryouts, and they may practice or rehearse certain parts, but to be able to do the whole thing together and to be able to plan for absolutely everything, it's almost impossible. So they would have to, be able to, come up with other ways of controlling or improvising, particularly if there are two. And I remember you saying when we first spoke, your sister was also physically very fit too.
Correct.
So, she'd been at the Naval Academy, but she took care of herself. So actually for compliance purposes, she was not somebody who would probably be compliant.
Well, not necessarily, although remember she was a naval officer and she'd been in the Navy for 5 years.
But I mean under threat, as opposed to somebody, she'd
Right.
be more likely to take instruction if she thought it were an authority figure.
Correct. But then you reach that point where you realize this individual is not who they claim to be, or they're going to hurt us. And the situation degenerates into something which could be, sadly, even a fight to the death.
Okay.
So this seems like a good time to take a break. So here's a word from our sponsors.
Hello, it's Jim Clementi and Francie Hakes with a special message about a new show that I'm hosting on Wondery called Locked Up Abroad. In each episode, people tell their harrowing stories of being convicted of crimes and jailed in foreign lands, or kidnapped and held hostage in war-torn countries.
These are definitely worst-case scenarios. They're truly frightening situations.
Yes, no best cases here.
But it is fascinating to hear how they manage to survive these ordeals.
In the first episode, Midnight Express, Billy Hayes tells us about being imprisoned in Turkey for smuggling hashish. Oliver Stone even made a movie about it. But that was the movie. This is the real story. I even had the chance to interview Billy Hayes recently, and he told me the whole story behind the story of how he escaped a Turkish prison. He even told me that he went back to Turkey years later. You have to hear his story to believe it.
And now, in his own words, here is Billy Hayes.
So now we're back and we're continuing our conversation.
Why don't we put a pin in that right there and just go over the four other cases, because just briefly, just how they were killed, what are the circumstances, because some of the information about controlling Cathy may have come out in a subsequent crime.
Before we move on, Bill, how old were you when this happened? I know we haven't gotten into any of that personal
I
aspect.
was
I'm sure we will, but
just shy of my 30th birthday.
oh,
So about a month shy of my 30th birthday. So 29 going on 30.
All right.
So
And Cathy was
27 and one of four kids in my family.
And Rebecca, 21.
yeah.
Right. Okay, so the second case is about a year later, September 22nd, 1987. David Nobling, who was 20, and Robin Edwards, who was 14, they were found shot to death at the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge, which is some distance away. This is a Virginia State Police case because they're not on federal property.
Right. But they were outside their car. The vehicle was found with the doors open, right?
Correct.
And
some versions even have this odd detail, the windshield wipers and the radio on in his David's pickup truck.
Okay.
And the window rolled halfway down. I've gone back to some original newspaper accounts, and sometimes these details vary from story to story. Okay. Their bodies were found a couple of days later. They'd been shot to death, and they'd been in the water. They'd been in the river.
So they were shot to death, and then they were dumped. Their bodies were dumped in the river.
Well, the police theorized that that David may have made a run for it because he seems to have been shot in the shoulder and then probably approached and hit with a kill shot to the head, and Robin killed in a similar fashion. Their bodies were not in good shape. They'd been in the water for 3 days, so the forensics are a little bit rough.
Okay, what about the third one?
The third case is technically a missing persons case. This is April 9th, 1988. Two Christopher Newport University students, Cassandra Haley, who went sometimes by Sandra or Sandy, and Richard Keith Call, he goes by Keith, were on a first date, and they went missing. They'd gone to a party. He had promised to have her back by 2 o'clock. I can think of myself in that situation. His 1982 red Celica was found kind of on a bluff, again now back on the Colonial Parkway.
Right, very close to where your sister's car was
Yeah,
found.
just a mile or two, down the road
Okay,
areas.
so as we analyze this case, we'll look at the possibility that your sister's case taught this killer enough to where he was able this time to dispose of the bodies in a way which was permanent, and they've never been found. So that's an aspect of MO that can be learned over time and may have actually, given your sister's circumstances, given the things that he learned about that type of situation, he or they learned about that type of situation, he may have then been able to actually utilize those tools now and actually perfected his way of disposing of the bodies.
The fourth case is October 1989. Now we're back to the fall again. Anna Maria Phelps, who was 18, and Daniel Lauer, who were 21, were found at a rest stop in New Kent County, which is, again, nearby, but this is on more of a major road. This is Interstate 64. This is a major highway. They were found at a rest stop. Their bodies were not found until 6 weeks after they had gone missing. So the assumption is, of course, that they would have died that night. There's some odd details here. Lauer's kind of beat up Chevrolet Nova is found on the opposite side of the highway from where they were going. They were driving down to Virginia Beach. The car is then found on the opposite side of the highway.
On the northbound side.
Yeah, headed away from Virginia Beach. So you begin to think about, perhaps a perpetrator or perpetrators moving cars around and that sort of thing.
But it's also possible, under the circumstances, that they pulled off into a rest stop on the one side, and and basically they couldn't find any privacy there, and they pulled around. They did a U-turn and found one on the other side that was more private.
Now, in this example, their bodies are found about 6 weeks later by hunters under a blanket off what I would almost characterize as like a logging road, a dirt road, about a mile as the crow flies from the rest stop. Unfortunately, their bodies were in really bad shape.
Is it north or south of the rest stop?
Not sure without looking at a map.
Okay. Yeah, so we should look at that because that's an important detail, and I think it'll inform us about whether or not they were deliberately at that other northbound side, or whether the offender dumped their bodies and then came back.
Mm-hmm. They believe the bodies were pretty badly decomposed, but at least one of them seems to have suffered knife wounds. They found nicks on the bones and that sort of thing.
Okay.
They were laid out side by side and covered with a blanket, and then leaves and that sort of thing had fallen. It had been quite wet and quite hot, so that it was a pretty advanced stage in terms of decomposition.
So they didn't know what killed the other person. The one was a knife wound.
It's undetermined, but the assumption is that both of them were stabbed. Certainly, there's no evidence of gunshot wounds or anything like
Was
that.
there any
notes
evidence
say-
of ligatures?
Just says Anna Marie died of a stab
not in
wound.
anything from the family members I've talked to and the news accounts I've read.
Okay. All right, so we have the first double homicide with your sister. They were bound, they were strangled with a rope, and their throats were cut. And then there was an attempt, albeit ineffective, to burn the car, but at least they were the offender was able to push the car to a place where it delayed discovery. In the second case, the car was found quickly. The doors were open. It looked like somebody, perhaps had fled from the car. They were found shot, not bound, not strangled, not cut with a knife. The third one, we have no idea what actually happened, but they went missing, and the car was found very close, in close proximity, a mile or two away from where your sister's and her girlfriend's body were found. But we don't know what actually happened to them because the bodies have never been located. The fourth one, there's indicators that their bodies were found not immediately near the car. They were found a mile or two away off a logging road. Their bodies were covered. There was no evidence of them being bound or gagged or strangled or having their throats cut because of the decay. You don't know what happened, but there's at least indicators that one of the victims was stabbed, and
That
that's
was Anna Maria.
and that's
who
how
was
she
stabbed.
died.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are the four cases. And Laura, if you wouldn't mind telling us the circumstances of the fifth case that happened about 10 years after the first one.
Sure. So on the 24th of May, and this is now 1996, as you said, 10 years later, Lolly or Laura Winans and Julianne Williams decide to go camping and hiking together. Now, they are in a relationship, but they keep that on the down low. So their family members were not aware that they were in a relationship. They were very private about it. They decided to go to the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. Now, Julianne was 24 at the time. Laura was 26. They were last seen on May the 24th. 2 days, they were picked up by a park ranger at one point, and their camera was found, so it kind of tracked their footsteps, if you like, the sequence of events. But their bodies were found, their hands were bound, their mouths were gagged, and their throats were slit. Their dog was left alive. One of them had a golden retriever called Taj, who made his way down to the campsite, and that's what sort of raised the alarm, as well as I think it was Laura's father also raised the alarm. What's sort of interesting about this case for me is, obviously the area is a isolated area, but their sexual orientation, along with the fact there was no signs of sexual assault, they were dressed, they were clothed, no sexual assault, no robbery. And again, it's an unsolved double homicide, which is particularly rare, to have two women who you would normally expect in this sort of situation for there to be some form of sexual assault, because these types of cases tend to be sexually motivated.
Do you have any idea where on the Appalachian Trail they were, or where they were found, with respect to the Colonial Parkway murders?
So they were at the Shenandoah National Park in Virginia, but I don't know exactly the
I think
exact spot.
from looking at maps, it looks to be 3 to 4 hours away. So
Yeah.
it's some distance away,
Yeah.
probably nearly 200 miles.
But also at a national park.
Yeah, there
That
are.
could be significant.
I can rattle off some similarities. Just a few quick things. Obviously, you have, and the FBI did say even publicly they were looking at substantial similarities. That was the expression they used between Cathy and Becky's murder specifically, and Julie and Lolly's murder. You've got athletic female couples, lesbian couples, in a national park on a holiday weekend. They're both over both of these murders were committed over 3-day weekends. Columbus Day in Cathy and Becky's example, Memorial Day in Julie and Lolly's case, and then obviously the way they were killed has some similarities. One thing I would add to what Laura just said is that they're on the trail, but it is the sort of place where there are access roads which are open to the public, which would allow someone with a vehicle to get fairly close to the site where they were camping. As a matter of fact, if they camped after dark, they may not have been aware of this, but there are these access roads, and members of the public do use them. So they might not actually have been in as isolated a location as they might have even preferred.
Mm-hmm.
But just give me a sense of, I love hiking and trails, and so if you've been there, give me a sense of sort of the area. I mean, how many people are you going to likely to be seeing?
Well, if you're
Is it
out,
quite a
if
busy
you're
place,
out on
or?
if you're out on the trail and you're hiking and you're moving from, camping site to camping site, you're probably going to see, maybe a few dozen people per day. Now, obviously, at places like where the Shenandoah Lodge is, there are restaurants there and, cabins, and, there are significantly more people in the area. There are a number of people many of whom I've spoken to directly, who have, who told me that they saw these two women and engaged with them, and one of them had a very distinctive cap on. It actually shows up in some of the photographs, sort of like what a railroad engineer would wear.
Yeah, I can see it in the picture here.
And they remembered that. And they also remembered they were both extremely nice, very smart, articulate, personable.
But in May, that area is going to be lush. It's going to be, hot out. It's going to be, but up in the mountains, it might be a little cooler. But, certainly it's the kind of place that would draw people on a holiday to do day hikes and longer hikes. But it may mean, the holiday weekend may mean that staff of the National Park Service would be at a minimum in both cases. So there would be less people working and policing those areas. All right, so now we've covered the 5 potential cases that are related, all double homicides, and all in Virginia, and all unsolved. And so why don't we now take some time, Bill, when Laura and I, and criminal behavioral analysts, look at cases, we start with victimology. We want to know as much as we can about the victim. And you, being Cathy's brother, you're an incredibly good source of information for who she was and what she was like and what she did with her life, what was going on in her life, the good and the bad. Because those details, however small, might be incredibly important for us and our behavioral analysis of the case.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that's a standout, when you take a look at the 4 double homicides that are referred to as the Colonial Parkway case, Cathy's significantly older than the rest of the victims. If you take a look at the 8 young people, they're mostly in high school or college. They range in age from 14 to 21. I'm putting Cathy aside for a second. They're living at home. They're either in high school or college. They haven't really done very much in terms of living their lives. Cathy, on the other hand, and to a certain extent Becky, but in particular Cathy. Cathy's 27 years old. She's substantially older than any of the other victims. She has already gone to the Naval Academy. She's in the second class with women in it. This was these are, I have to remind people, this was 30 years ago. This was a really big deal. She has been through an incredibly difficult time
So
at
this
the
was
Naval Academy.
groundbreaking that she
It really
actually
was.
attended and graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy. And I'm sure there were women who tried that who didn't make it through the process, right?
Correct. Actually, to our knowledge, my father is a Naval Academy grad. He's class of 53, and my older brother Richard is a Naval Academy grad. He's class of 75. They're actually the first father, son, daughter graduates of the Naval Academy. So Cathy, in that regard, has gone to the Naval Academy, actually been through a very difficult experience. People don't understand just how unwelcoming the service academies were.
In terms of sort of sexism?
Sexism, and really, they were treated very, very shabbily. They were made to feel very unwelcome at all the service academies. I'm not just picking on the Naval Academy, and I come from a Navy family. But it was a very, very difficult time. They really tried to break these women. The class of 1980 had been the first class with women in it, and 81. And as a matter of fact, there was sort of a grim determination on the part of these women to get through almost against all odds.
So they were no doubt working to sort of 150% capacity
Exactly.
to make it
Yeah,
work.
all those cliches about how a woman has to be smarter and better, well, they're all true in this example. That you really have to be that much better than the guys just to
Keep
get
your
a
head above water.
just to,
Yeah.
and get a passing grade.
It's interesting you say that because when I was I think it was in 2004, 2005, when I was teaching class at the FBI Academy, I still saw then that the women were held to a different standard. And in fact, one young woman who was going through the FBI Academy, she overachieved, and she was the first one to class, the first one done with exercises, the best one in firearms, the best one. And there were male instructors who thought, we need to get rid of her because there's obviously something wrong with her. She always has to be first. And I said, if that was a guy, you'd be giving her awards.
Yeah.
What the hell are you talking about?
They'd be wearing a gold star.
But they just did not want somebody who was that sort of tightly wound in their mind to be in the FBI. And it just totally baffled me that how this could still be going on in 2004, 2005.
Yeah.
And obviously, I mean, she was not out at that time.
No,
Yeah, of
no.
course,
This
because
is
she's
this
in
is the if you were gay and you were in the service, you were immediately discharged,
Dishonorably, right?
dishonorably discharged. And as a matter of fact, Cathy made a decision to get out of the Navy. If you go to the Naval Academy or any of the service academies, you owe them 5 years. And so she made a decision after a pretty rough ride in the Navy to get out after 5 years, now, which was a great disappointment to her on a personal level because she came from a Navy family. Again, I have to remind people, this was before Don't Ask, Don't Tell. You got kicked out of the service if they found out you were gay or lesbian. In particular, they targeted lesbians.
But when you say that, it's not just that if they found out. They were actively investigating females to determine whether or not they were gay because they were trying to unearth and kick out women who were gay, right?
That's correct. So, but if you back to sort of where was Cathy in her life, she had decided to get out after 5 years and was kind of at a crossroads in the months before her death. She left the Navy. She was working as a stockbroker, and I remember she was talking to the family about perhaps going back to graduate school. She was very interested in international relations. She had been a Russian scholar at the Naval Academy.
Wow.
And so she was very interested in perhaps foreign service or something like that, or going back and getting an MBA and perhaps working in some sort of, international relations or, some sort of capacity like that. So she was thinking about leaving Williamsburg, which at this point was beginning to feel small. And the whole Norfolk area, for your listeners, that's one of the largest Navy bases on the East Coast of the United States. And it was probably time for her to begin leaving some of that behind. So she was talking to us about, applying to graduate schools and maybe moving up to Washington, D.C. And then for Becky, Rebecca Dowski, she was 21. She was a senior at William and Mary. She was a transfer student. She'd gone in because of a particular business program that she liked at William and Mary. She transferred from a smaller college in Pennsylvania. And I think this was my sister's second romantic relationship with a woman. She'd met and fallen in love with a shipmate on a ship she'd served on board. This was Becky's first gay relationship. So she'd never been involved in with a woman as far as we know. As a matter of fact, when I first spoke to her family, they weren't, and this was 23 years after the two girls had died, they weren't 100% sure whether or not she was lesbian to that point. And I remember in my first conversation saying to her brother, well, I'm here to tell you that those stories are true, because my attitude now is we have to move past this stuff.
Yes.
And these young people, none of them did anything wrong as near as we can tell, and they're entitled to live their lives. And so I think that's very important. But when you look at where Cathy and Becky were in their lives versus, without diminishing the other young people are kind of at a little bit of an earlier stage. They haven't really lived away from home. They haven't gone away to school, or their careers haven't taken them, away from their home base yet. And so in that way, Cathy and Becky's victimology, to use Laura's expression, is a bit different from the other victims.
Except that when you look at all of these victims, it's every single one of them has an older person and a younger person.
Yes.
None of them are the same age. None of them are at exactly the same stage of life. So I don't know that it is actually that much different. You can tell me. I mean, I see a picture here of Cathy. She looks pretty young. How old did she look when she was 27?
No, she looked very young. And in other words, we hadn't met Becky at the time of their death. We were supposed to meet them that Thanksgiving. They were going to come up to my parents' house.
I'm sorry, I should ask this before. Was you and your family aware that she was lesbian? And did that matter? Did it?
No. I mean, it's two of the four kids in my family were gay. The two older ones, my older brother Richard and I, are straight, and the two younger ones were gay. I mean, it's something we all struggled with. I mean, it's kind of a shock when someone that you know and love comes out
At that time.
Sure. At that time. Again, when I talk to people now and they're applying 2016 attitudes towards being gay and lesbian, it's a lot different back then. And then you mix in the Navy, Virginia, a pretty conservative state and a very strongly military area, and the public policy that was involved, where it was illegal to be gay or lesbian and be in the service. Those things are very different now than they were then.
Yeah. Well, this seems like a good time to take a little break and hear a word from or about our sponsors. We're back, and fortunately today in 2016, times have changed, attitudes have changed, and laws have changed about sexuality. Fortunately, we've moved forward as a country and as a people. But let's get back to the case.
So, Bill, I'm sitting here talking to you, and you're talking in such detail about this murder and these murders, and I just want to kind of go back to when this happened. What was that like? How did you find out? What was your? I can't even imagine what this news did to you and your family.
Yeah, it's a little hard to grasp. This is one of those bizarre situations where, like a lot of things in life, it starts with a phone call. Bad news, comes in a phone call. I remember it was a Sunday. I was at home. I was living and working in Philadelphia. I was working for RCA at the time. The phone rang. It was my parents. We were pretty close. We would talk pretty frequently. Irish Catholic family from Boston. It was both my parents on the phone, which was a little funny. And my dad said to me, "You better sit down." And I remember thinking, what a strange expression that was. What do you mean I need to sit down? And then he told me. Now, keep in mind, he would have been calling all three brothers. My sister Cathy was the youngest of four, three boys and a girl. And so they would have had to have made this phone call 3 times in a row. And my dad did most of the talking. My mom was kind of quiet anyway. And they told me that Cathy had been killed. And we knew right away that it was an FBI case because it was on federal property. And so we all gathered at my parents' house up in Massachusetts, probably the next day. And then I remember we were up there for kind of family meetings, and I remember the FBI came and talked to us about the case, and they asked us a lot of questions. And it's funny, I remember they had already been to my sister's apartment, and they said the girl is gay and the parents know, because they had read. My sister was incredibly organized and methodical, and she'd saved every Christmas card, every letter, everything, all completely organized in these plastic boxes, very Cathy Thomas. And so they had read all of her letters, and so they saw all the letters back and forth with the family. And so, they said, the girl is gay and the parents know. So it wasn't news to us as a family that Cathy was involved in a romantic relationship. As a matter of fact, that we were looking forward to meeting Becky.
You were going to meet her
at Thanksgiving at the same parents' house.
But the next month.
Yeah, but then you end up in this. It's just like this whirlwind. Everything in your life has been completely upended, and I would say for the next year, everything was just so topsy-turvy. And then I know when you've talked to other victims of violent crime, then every little thing, every Thanksgiving, it's the first Thanksgiving, it's the first Christmas, it's the first New Year's, all these family and kind of fun, positive benchmarks that you go through in a year. Every single one of them was, the first time, since Cathy died. And I remember us having a great deal of faith in the FBI. And we were, I don't know if pleased is the right word, but we thought, this is a good thing that this is a federal case, and not a local case. But, it ultimately, it becomes something that you sort of just incorporate, or in my opinion, it will destroy you. Now, I've talked to a lot of other victims in the Colonial Parkway murders and in other cases, and I've reached out to a lot of family members, and you kind of reach a place where you're either going to let it destroy you or you're not. And, I know people that allowed it to destroy them, drugs, alcohol, you name it.
I imagine that, it's bad enough when one of your loved ones are killed, whether it's a car accident or such. But to know that she died the way she did, that just must have ripped you apart. And, why her? Why? So many questions,
Yeah, and without diminishing, the loss that someone would feel who lost someone in an automobile accident or to disease or what have you. I'm not minimizing their loss in any way, but the whole thing just seems so senseless. And, over time, sometimes I do the math in my head and I'll think, how old would Cathy be and what would she be doing now? That sort of thing. Now we've reached a point where Cathy's been gone longer than she would be alive.
What was the media reporting like at the time? Were they quite intrusive, or was the case covered in detail? Or
it was. I remember we were on the front page of the New York Post or the Daily News, one of the two tabloids. Co-eds, throats slashed. And all they had were driver's license photographs. In retrospect, I think my family made a mistake in that my family refused to do any media whatsoever. Even, for instance, the Lowell Sun, which is up in Massachusetts, our hometown newspaper. We knew the reporters from the Lowell Sun. They'd gone to school with us. My parents refused to do any media. They didn't do a single interview, didn't talk to a single reporter. We provided nothing.
Why was that, Bill?
Well, it was kind of a very Irish Catholic thing to do. I think my mom actually kind of drove this agenda. She said, if you cooperate with the media, they'll write things about you, they'll report things about you that aren't true. Now, keep in mind too, Cathy was out to my family, but there was embarrassment's probably not too strong a word. They didn't want to acknowledge that Cathy was gay in a public
you
way.
might blame that for the.
Oh, of course,
that's
of course.
What
It was certainly not just oh, well, that's just not news. That would have been a major issue, right?
Sure. But when all the television stations and there were radio news stations back then and the newspapers, and we just shut down. We just did not. We said no.
Were they reporting the fact that they were in a gay relationship?
No. And that never really made the media. So they were presented as co-eds, which is kind of absurd because Cathy was 27 years old and had been out of the Naval Academy for 5 years. But they, the story just kind of came and went. And it wasn't until 2009, 7 years ago, when a news story broke that I became aware of, that we really went out and sought significant media coverage.
So this sounds like maybe a good place to wrap up this segment of our coverage of the Colonial Parkway murders, and we have much, much more to talk to Bill about, and after this episode, we can get more into the victimology and continue to process all this information.
Yeah, it's a very complicated case, but Bill, we really appreciate you going down the rabbit holes with us, and I'm sure that it brings up some pretty horrible feelings. And again, we just want to be sensitive to that because we want to honor Cathy.
Well, thank you. I appreciate all of your interest.
Bill, our listeners love to dive deep into these cases with us. They love to read about it. They love to watch things that they can get their hands on. So what would you recommend? What resources would you recommend that they look into?
Well, the first thing I'd recommend is take a look at the Colonial Parkway killer. I hate the name. I don't know why we're focused on killers as opposed to victims, but maybe that's just me. Take a look on the Wikipedia
You could always
page.
edit the Wikipedia page. Why not call it something else?
I have done an extensive amount of editing personally. I've had issues with Wiki over the years, but the Wikipedia page, the U.S. version's quite good on the Colonial Parkway killer. I can tell you personally, I've gone through everything, and to the best of my knowledge, it's all pretty accurate to the best of our ability. And there are a lot of links to media coverage of the case, television interviews, radio interviews. There's a couple of other podcasts that have covered the case quite well, and a lot of newspaper articles over the years covering the case, some of them quite good and some of them very much in-depth.
But like you said, I mean, rarely do they ever focus on the victim or victims. So that's what we see in pretty much every case. So it would be much better for it to be, much more focused around the victims rather than, the unknown person or persons who did this.
So we're doing this, as I said earlier, for Cathy and for Rebecca, not for whoever this killer is. One of the things that when I started consulting on Criminal Minds, one of the things they kept asking me was, what about this killer? What about that killer? And I would say, I don't even recognize those names, but tell me the names of the people that they killed. Those are the cases that I worked. I don't remember those guys that we threw in jail. They don't deserve any kind of fame. I try to forget their names as soon as we lock them up. So it was a real change in perspective for the people in Hollywood, at least, about it. But
it's the same as the way that I've always worked, and that's why Jim and I have always had great synergy. I mean, all my presentations, I actually have slide after slide of all the victims' faces. and go through their names and the roll call of them, because they're the ones that we should be remembering, and they're the ones that we should be telling the stories through, not through those people who have committed those crimes. It's an interesting thing, 'cause you'll notice, you notice it everywhere once you understand that concept. But it should, that light bulb moment, I mean, it should happen really for everybody now, that we should be talking about the victims, not those individuals who actually, once we've caught them, they shouldn't have a platform to carry on manipulating or doing the things that they have done in the past.
And actually,
I think it's a good point.
Actually, one of our listeners recently wrote to me asking if we could cover a certain serial killer, and he used his name. And I said, we did cover that. We never mentioned his name, but we mentioned Samantha Koenig, who was his victims. And it was like a light bulb. He's like, oh, right. He had heard that podcast, but, so.
Right, and for those offenders and killers who want the control, that's all you keep giving them is that control and notoriety, and they take over.
And a lot of us will appear on nationally televised TV shows and news programs, and we have for a long time, over a decade, been trying to get them to stop mentioning the names of school shooters and mass killers and serial killers, and just make them be anonymous, force them into anonymity instead of the victims, and give the victims a voice. And I think,
switch out the victim blaming and shaming.
well, all right. Well, that is a wonderful thing, and that we're able to do that. And we really appreciate you being here to help us get more information about the victimology, because, again, that drives our criminal behavioral analysis, but it also brings a voice back to your sister and the other victims of this crime.
Thank you.
So that wraps up this episode of Real Crime Profile. We'll be back with Bill Thomas talking about his sister, Cathy Thomas, and the other Colonial Parkway murder victims.
So if you like our show and you want to help us out, there are a couple things you can do. First, you can go over to iTunes and leave us a positive 5-star review. You can also like our Facebook page and join in on some great questions, comments, and conversations. We always love to hear from you there. You can follow us on Twitter. You can check out our sponsors. And most importantly, you can share us with friends, family, and anyone you know who's interested in real crime and the minds that solve those crimes. Thanks for listening.
For advice or support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0207 840 8960 or go on the website www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic violence, call the National Domestic Violence Helpline free phone 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, shelter, safety or counselling, call the Genesis 24-hour hotline 214-946-4357 or go on the website www.genesisshelter.org, or you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline on 800 799 7233.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan, engineered by Jacob Moose Molin. Music is composed and performed by Simba Sumba. Logo art by Rob Cohen. Real Crime Profile is produced and recorded at Empire Studios LA by XG Productions. Real Crime Profile is distributed by Wondery.